Hello, and welcome to the New South Wales Policy Professionals Community of Practice webinar series. We are very excited today to kick off our year. And before I get started, and as host of the meeting today, I'll acknowledge that we're on the lands of Aboriginal people. And wherever you're joining us from, I acknowledge that that land remains Aboriginal land. And the traditional owners of that land and elders past, present and emerging. Today's webinar, we are joined by the fabulous team, and there's quite a few of them, so I'm very excited to have so many people from New South Wales Treasury's Centre for Economic Evidence present on the First Nations Investment Framework. We'll hear from Edwina Chen, Steve Legg, Laura Faulkner, Eugenia Marembo, Lateisha Peachey, and Sam Matheson. And we're going to be talking through the First Nations Investment Framework. It's a guide to good practice in working with First Nations people and communities on the design, appraisal, evaluation of initiatives, and the framework supplements the New South Wales Government's existing policies and guidance, building evidence across the investment lifecycle. So I'm really looking forward to this. The Wellbeing, Economic Wellbeing branch within New South Wales Treasury leads the development and application of economic frameworks to support evidence-based decision-making and improve wellbeing in the New South Wales community. And the First Nations Economic Wellbeing work was established in 2020 to build the evidence base in government around what works for First Nations outcomes and closing the gap. I might stop there and then hand over. We're going to have a presentation from the team and there'll be time for Q&A at the end. The session is recorded, so just bear that in mind. And I'll give more instructions on how to ask questions when we get a bit further into it. And also, I understand we're going to be doing some audience interaction today. So if you haven't got it nearby, make sure you grab your phone or access so you can participate in that process. So I'll hand over now to Edwina, Stephen and Lateisha. I can see they're ready. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Louisa, so much. My name is Lateisha Peachey. I am an economist at the First Nations Economics Wellbeing branch at New South Wales Treasury. And so we will just give you a quick overview of the First Nations Investment Framework today, which is a new Treasury policy and guideline. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. So we'll take about 25-30 minutes to present, and then at the end we'll have Q&A. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat during the session, and we will come to you at the end. So if I could get you next slide. Yep. So as Louisa mentioned, if you could just join at slido.com, I'll just post the link in the chat as well. You can also scan the QR code there. And we will just ask you just a few quick questions. Just 3 questions, short, just to get a sense of how familiar you are with the framework, what some of the challenges are when incorporating First Nations perspectives into your work. And then at the end, there's also a word cloud where you can add a word or two about what you think is most important when building genuine partnerships. And so that will help us tailor the conversation and understand what's top of mind for you. So I might just share my screen really quickly. Please let me know if you can see that. Just a thumbs up if you can. Thank you. I'll just give everyone just a couple of minutes just to jump in there.
Lateisha, I'm in the poll, but it doesn't show any questions yet. Is that right?
See the question now?
Oh, yes. Great.
Okay, cool. So first question is, how familiar are you with the First Nations Investment Framework? Is today your first time hearing about it, or have you heard about it before? You're not really sure what it is, but you've heard about it. Hey, looks like it's everyone's first time hearing about it today. That's good. Okay, next question is, what is the biggest challenge when incorporating First Nations perspectives into your policy work? So is it knowing who to engage, building relationships, cultural capability, finding time and resources, or you're just not sure where to start? Knowing who to engage looks to be like a big challenge. Okay, so our presentation today will give you some of those insights, and the framework should be able to answer some of that stuff as well. The last one is, what's the most important ingredient for genuine partnerships? So it could just be one or two words. Listening, yes. Trust, respect. That's some really good stuff there. Transparent communication, connection. That's beautiful. Two-way learning. Okay, we're going to cross a couple of those things off today in our presentation. Thank you so much for that. So I'll stop sharing and I'm going to pass over to Edwina. If Eugenia can share again, yep. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Lateisha. Good morning, everyone. It's very lovely to be with you here today, and thank you so much to Louisa and the New South Wales Policy Professionals Contract team for the invitation to present. My name is Edwina Chen. I'm the Acting Director of the First Nations Economic Wellbeing team here at New South Wales Treasury. I've been here for about 2.5 years now in this team, and prior to coming across, I was at the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council for many, many years working in economic development and program implementation. So I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues here today. You can see their wonderful faces on the screen. They will introduce themselves as they come on to speak and present. But this slide give you a bit of a preview as to what they look like. So just the next slide, please, Eugenia. Thank you. So the First Nations Economic Wellbeing team sits within the Centre for Economic Evidence, as Louisa mentioned, and CEE sits within the broader Economic Strategy and Productivity Group. And this leads the development and application of economic frameworks to support evidence-based decision-making and improve the wellbeing of the New South Wales community. We promote and advise on the practice of public economics to advance the effectiveness, efficiency and equity of government resource allocation. CEE's main functions are to advise government on the economic merit of strategic initiatives with a focus on cost-benefit analysis to ensure decisions are evidence-based and allocate resources to the most welfare-enhancing initiatives. We also develop, maintain and build capability in policies, frameworks and tools that support evidence-based decision-making, including business cases, cost-benefit analysis, evaluation, employment and benefits management. We develop, maintain and advise on the use of the First Nations Investment Framework and provide leadership for Priority Reform 5 of Closing the Gap, which focuses on First Nations employment and economic prosperity. We also have developed and maintained a new performance and wellbeing framework, which improves accountability, advances outcomes, and elevates consideration of wellbeing in policy advice. And last but not least, we produce high-quality public resources on key issues. In our team, this includes the First Nations Business Sector Report, the First Nations Women's Economic Participation Review, and more broadly, the shadow price of carbon. So our team, the First Nations Economic Wellbeing team, or FNU as we like to call it, in keeping with Treasury's commitment to reconciliation and improving the prosperity of New South Wales First Nations people and communities, as well as our role as the government's principal economic and financial management advisor, Treasury plays a leading role in reforming government, financial management, and ensuring investments to improve outcomes for First Nations people and communities are both evidence-based and efficient. Government agencies rely on our stewardship of such a challenging policy area, given First Nations programs are scattered throughout government with no strong oversight on how they interrupt. Our team was established in 2020 to build the evidence base in government around what works to improve First Nations outcomes and to help in closing the gap. We take a principles-based approach to our work and are led by 4 key principles. The first one being partnership, where we do things with First Nations people and organisations, not to them. The second prong is a listening approach. So we take a searcher's mentality, where we listen with an open mind instead of a set or preconceived agenda. Thirdly, reciprocity. The information is in a two-way flow, where we aren't just extracting information from Aboriginal communities. And lastly, we take a strengths-based approach. So we focus on the capabilities, skills, knowledge, connections, and the potential in individual communities. Our commitment to this policy area has been welcomed by both the sector and the First Nations communities that we work with. In terms of the work that we deliver, we're here today to talk about the LEF publication, the First Nations Investment Framework. We also are involved largely in Priority Reform 4 of Closing the Gap, which speaks to data sharing with regional communities. And as I mentioned, the 2 other publications, the First Nations Business Sector Report. Keep an eye out, there's a second iteration coming soon, hopefully later this month. And the publication on the right there, the First Nations Women's Economic Participation Review. If your departments or agencies are keen to be briefed on any of this work, feel free to reach out to the team via email, and our contact details will be at the end of the presentation. But the purpose of why we're here today, so the First Nations Investment Framework. Today, my team will take you through this framework. This will include the journey to date, past listening and engagement theories, and what you'll get in the investment framework, and how we intend to work together moving forward. So thank you so much, and I'll now pass you on to my colleague, Steve Legg.
Hi all, great to see a whole bunch of former DCJ and transport colleagues on this, but hi to everyone. You're probably wondering a bit like, why have we done this? So as Edwina spoke to earlier, we were set up to build the evidence base in government around what works to improve First Nations outcomes and close the gap. The First Nations Investment Framework is a commitment under Closing the Gap Priority Reform 3, transforming government organisations. It's in the 22-24 implementation plan as deliver First Nations specific guidance for evaluation and economic appraisal. Having said that, the practical steps, principles and guiding questions have been designed for business case development and evaluation, but they're applicable everywhere. So for policy development and reform as well. It's been developed with Aboriginal people. So the New South Wales Coalition of Aboriginal Regional Alliances has actually formally endorsed it. We've had positive feedback from our colleagues at the Coalition of Aboriginal Peak Organisations. We've also had significant input from consultation with your agencies, particularly your evaluation teams, investment and assurance, finance, and First Nations teams. Applied well, it'll help us progress from isolated good practice, and we do have some case studies for you later, and cultural awareness work to that actual systemic change. I think for this audience in a policy context, it's worth reading the Australian Government Productivity Commission review into Closing the Gap, which really highlighted that we're grappling to understand the depth and magnitude of commitment that our government signed us up to under Closing the Gap. We're nested in that Priority Reform 3, transforming government organisations, and that's a real enabler for all of the other priority reforms. So there's a risk if we don't do this well, we'll fail at all the other work as well. So this guidance will help you with that. It'll help change the way you work with Aboriginal communities. I think it's very, very handy that a central agency like Treasury has produced it. It really gives you something you can point to. So the broader New South Wales investment framework, just on the next slide. This is the mainstream New South Wales investment framework. It identifies requirements, recommendations and guidance for different stages of initiative development, appraisal, monitoring and evaluation. It applies to everything, so projects, programs, regulations, policies. The framework includes a whole bunch of technical notes, supplementary guidance and primary guidance documents. We don't have it up on here, but we've actually published a paper on carbon emissions, not our team, but CEE. So you'll also see business case guidelines, evaluation guidelines. So I can see there's quite a few of our evaluation colleagues on the call. So TPG 2222. We've fully integrated the First Nations investment framework into the mainstream investment framework. And that's very consistent with what our Closing the Gap partners have been asking of us, that we make a lot of this Aboriginal targeted work business as usual, everyone's business, not something sort of sitting off to the side. The First Nations investment framework does not provide any mandatory requirements. So you've got some flexibility in how you apply it, depending on the community that you're working with. And it doesn't have a checklist style step-by-step instructions. It's guidance, and you need to tailor what you do to the community that you're working with. And the practical steps, guiding questions and principles, they're applicable everywhere. So Laura will talk more in a moment about what the different chapters and steps are, but they apply basically everywhere. You sort of think of it as a manual for changing the way we work with Aboriginal communities. We're out. So this is kind of just an exciting one for us. We're out. We published October last year. At the risk of sounding a bit self-promoting for the team, we're the first Australian jurisdiction to publish guidance like this. And we actually just presented it at Secretary's Board. So there's senior leadership support and really, to be honest, like some great momentum with it. So how do we kind of go about all this? It's actually 4 years of work from the team. So before my time, I was actually using some of the work this team put out when I was at Transport, developing like an Aboriginal outcomes framework there. So it is actually, I'd say it's actually quite excellent work, to be honest. So we've been out learning by listening. So extensive research and consultation to understand key challenges in current practice and gaps in capability for evaluation and economic appraisal of First Nations initiatives. We actually had 3 different series of engagement. There was a listening series, an interview series, and then an evaluation series. And we've been learning by doing. So all the, we just call them new measures now, but new policy proposals that come into Treasury where people are showing like good practice, we're reviewing those, we're providing commentary back to the sector. We're also learning from those. So the same goes for evaluations. And we've had 2 key research papers come out. So going back to that, learning by listening, there's a consultation listening series on evaluation practice, came out August 2022. And we further refined that advice when we did a cost benefit analysis research paper, December 2023. And since then, I think Edwina pointed to it at the beginning, but there's been a Valuing First Nations Cultures in Cost Benefit Analysis paper come out as well, late 20, yeah. And in that paper, we look at capturing culture in 2 main ways, either as an input to an initiative or as an outcome. We've got a couple of case studies that will come up later. But Laura will talk to that in more detail, and I'll hand over to her now.
Thanks, Steve. Pleasure to be dialing in from Bidjigal country today. So based on what we heard through consultation, we developed a 5-step structure for the framework, which is shown here on the diagram. The first 2 chapters at the top are really about setting up how we work together. So what preparation work you need to do within your organization? That includes exploring existing relationships, guidance on opening dialogue with potential partners, and then agreeing a governance structure together. And then the next 3 green boxes, chapters 4, 5, and 6, cover topics that you need to consider with your partners as you work together on your project. So in each chapter, we've got guidance material, questions to prompt your thinking, case studies, and also links to further resources, because there is a lot of material out there on these topics. So what we hope we've done is bring that all together in a bit of a structure that the government audience across New South Wales can follow, and use that to guide our practice and make sure that we're sort of considering all the really important factors that we've heard from First Nations people and communities that are important. So just on the next slide, we've got a diagram on sort of when the framework should be used. So as Steve mentioned, this fills a gap in the set of investment framework policies and guidelines. So it's really been designed to support any work that involves using or developing evidence for initiatives that have impacts on First Nations people and communities. And as Steve also mentioned, we've defined initiative quite broadly. So it could be a policy, a project, a service, a regulation, a strategy, a program. And what that means is it doesn't have to have funding attached. So there are obviously, we've got the investment lifecycle diagram shown here, but many of you will be familiar with similar diagrams reflecting the policy development cycle. And it's really about the same thing. How do we make sure that we're using the best information that we have and speaking to the right people to make sure that our policies are being designed in an informed way, that we've got the right options on the table, and that we're making sure we're checking whether we're on track or not. So what this framework does is give us guidance on how to work through different stages of that cycle, and do that in partnership, as the government has committed us to do, and because we know that that's going to get us better outcomes. The other point to make here is that the framework isn't just restricted to First Nations specific initiatives, of course, but also any kind of general initiative that's got a significant First Nations impact. So in our summary document, and also the framework itself, we've got some guidance on what those types of general initiatives could look like. But yeah, really encourage you to use your judgment and think through whether the work you're doing, whether there's an impact there, where it could benefit from setting up a partnership and opening that dialogue with First Nations communities, so that you get a better result. The next slide just points to a couple of the case studies that we've included in the framework. And I guess the intention here is to demonstrate what can be achieved when these approaches are embedded in our processes. So we've just got a couple here. The first is about the new Dubbo Bridge project. So in that project that's underway at the moment, 32% of the workforce identifies as Aboriginal, and that's in a community where the Aboriginal share of the population is around 16%. So a really significant outcome that's been achieved. And we spoke to Three Rivers Regional Assembly, which is the local decision-making body for the region. And they spoke to us about really they've been able to achieve this outcome working really closely with the company that's delivering the project, as well as transport. And they said that the 2 key ingredients to getting to this point have been early engagement. So they really appreciated that they were part of those conversations with Abergailty Constructions, who have been doing the work right early on in the piece, and a genuine commitment to work together so that they could ensure that there were opportunities for the local population, local community members to be involved in the project. And obviously that's got significant flow-on benefits for those people and the broader community as well. The next example is a structure in place that's been happening since actually 2017 through the Commonwealth. So Barang Regional Alliance is a representative voice to all tiers of government on behalf of the Aboriginal community living on Darkinjung country, which is in the central coast of New South Wales. So Barang is also a member of New South Wales's local decision-making framework, but they also participate under the Commonwealth's Empowered Communities Initiative as a backbone organisation. So they've had this shared decision-making process under empowered communities in place for a number of years now, where Barang is responsible for recruiting, convening and developing and sort of setting up these expert panels of independent community members that then provide advice to the Commonwealth Government agencies on funding streams. So they give advice on new proposals that are coming through for investment in the region, as well as evaluation of past initiatives. And that advice makes its way up to the relevant minister or its delegate. So it's a really great mechanism for their direct influence over what's happening in the community and holding service providers to account. And so it's obviously really successful in how it's been operating for so long. So there's just a couple of examples, and we're hoping to build up a case study bank, which we'd love input from those on the call in the next year or so. But we'll talk to that in a little bit. I'll now pass over to Lateisha, who's going to give you a bit more of a deeper dive into some of the chapters of the framework.
Thanks, Laura. So we'll start with foundations for genuine relationships. So one of the key parts of the framework is about building genuine long-term relationships with First Nations communities. And it shouldn't be looked at as a tick-a-box step. So it's foundational to embedding a First Nation-centred approach. And that can look like cultural safety. So this means moving beyond just being culturally aware. It's about doing the work to reflect on your own assumptions and adapting your approach so you create a space that's respectful, inclusive, and free from racism or bias. Planning and resourcing. So relationships take time, and it's important to budget not just dollars, but time and capacity. So especially if there's travel involved, to build and maintain relationships in line with local community protocols. Having a principles-based approach, so setting clear standards upfront helps build trust. Being transparent and accountable shows communities that you're serious about working in partnership. Ethical responsibilities, so ask yourself, will this work genuinely benefit the community? Have we talked about risks and got consent? Seeking consent is a powerful way to support self-determination. Some questions that you could reflect on are, what might you or your team bring and how could they shape your work? How are you embedding First Nations perspectives from the beginning? Have you had real open conversations with community about the benefits and risks of your initiative? And these aren't just one-off steps, so they help lay the groundwork for trusted, respectful and lasting relationships. And we're also starting to see a broader shift happening across government with more Aboriginal evaluation and cost-benefit analysis experts coming through. So that's a really big part of this transformation. And building on that idea of genuine relationships, so this next part of the framework is about partnerships and specifically shared decision-making. So we've all heard the term partnership, but this part of the framework really digs into what that actually means and how it's different from just consulting or informing. So you'll see this spectrum of engagement here ranges from simply providing information all the way to truly empowering communities where decisions are made together or even by community. Not every project will reach that final step, but the key message here is that we need to shift away from doing things to or for communities and start doing things with communities. And what does that look like in practice? So it starts with asking who your First Nations partners should be, and then think about what the partnership will involve, what's in scope and what decisions will be shared, and how you'll work together, what governance will you set up. Also think about whether partners have the capacity to be involved, whether you need to procure independent experts with the right cultural capability, and whether there are opportunities to use non-traditional procurement pathways. For example, the Aboriginal Cultural Landscape Management Project worked in partnership with local Aboriginal lands councils, universities and Transport to co-design their approach. And as Laura mentioned earlier, so this isn't just for Aboriginal specific initiatives. We hope to see these approaches adopted more widely across mainstream projects that impact Aboriginal people. And finally, if you're bringing in consultants, involve First Nations perspectives right from the start, even in designing the scope of work. I will hand over to Eugenia.
Thanks, Lateisha. So the next chapter that we have in the framework is on community-led design. This is chapter 3 of the framework, and it also flows on to the CBA section, which is the technical appendix that Laura had mentioned when she provided the overview of the framework. The key takeaways from this chapter are the importance of adopting a community perspective. So apologies for that, seems to be muting. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're back on now.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So I'll just start over again. So chapter 3 of the framework looks at how community-led design and ensuring that outcomes are aligned with values, priorities, and the aspirations of First Nations communities. So essentially looking at defining outcomes at a local level and ensuring that First Nations people are defining what success looks like. We also explore how culture can improve broader outcomes, and this is in the chapter where we introduce the economic framework of culture, which has been mentioned before, essentially looking at culture as an input into an initiative, and then how cultural inputs can influence broader outcomes through different effects, and then looking at the outcomes that are then achieved in that space as well. So we're recognizing culture as an asset, and as mentioned, this is strongly linked to the CBA technical appendix. But some of the key messages here are also ensuring that we're focusing on the qualitative outcomes and not shying away from examining those and looking at ways in which they can be integrated in the design of initiatives and how those could potentially be measured in partnership with First Nations people. The next chapter that we have is on data collection, access, and analysis. So essentially looking at embedding the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty and governance in evaluation practice and in the analysis stages as well. It's also linked to the PR4 work that's been progressing in government as well. So the 4 key areas that we provide guidance on in this chapter around looking at data that is meaningful to First Nations people, ensuring that we're taking culturally appropriate data collection practices into what we're doing, and ensuring that even the storage approach, the analysis, everything that is being done, we do have First Nations people involved throughout the process. We also provide guidance on what it means to take a First Nations informed approach to the analysis. So often when evaluations are done or when assessments are being conducted, we often find that the step where we're sense checking and cross-checking with community to ensure that the interpretations that we have are correct are often missed in the process. So essentially, we're encouraging that in the approach that's taken to any analysis, First Nations people should be involved in this process and working in partnership throughout the life cycle of any initiative, including evaluation as well. The final slide I'll speak to at this point is around transparency and accountability, which is one of the chapters that we have. So essentially, we recognize that there are different views. Often we find that First Nations and Western understandings of what accountability looks like differ. And it's important to work, again, this is a consistent theme throughout the framework, to work in partnership with First Nations people. What does transparency look like right from the inception of an initiative right through to the end, whether it's an evaluation or the development of a business case? And looking at designing initiatives from that early stage of accountability, what does that look like? So accountability starts from when partnerships are formed and ensuring that monitoring capabilities have been embedded to support the accountability aspect as well. We also provide guidance on reporting findings, so ensuring that we're developing knowledge translation plans, recognizing that often the way in which evaluation reports are presented and how we report information may not be the appropriate way to be communicating with community. So it's important to understand how findings are going to be translated, how they'll be shared with community. And this is another key thing that's also addressed in the data chapter. Data custodianship, what does that look like? Who are the custodians of data? How is that then reported? How is that presented? And then the accessibility component as well once findings have been presented. The final step or the final section that we provide guidance on is around how the findings are used to inform new initiatives that are being developed, but also how to iterate on programs and different initiatives and ensuring that we're taking that evidence-based approach that is First Nations informed in how we are progressing with initiatives. So I'll now hand over to Laura to talk a bit more about the economic framework of culture and how this applies to the cost-benefit analysis technical appendix.
Thanks, Eugenia. So as we've mentioned, those 5 steps that we've talked through apply, through all stages of policy development or investment in sort of developing and using evidence. But we thought that there would also be benefit in providing an example of how it applies in a specific context, specifically for cost-benefit analysis. So this is a tool, many of you would be probably familiar with it. It's an economic tool or process that we undertake often for budget bids to show whether or not the benefits of an initiative exceed the costs. And so there's an existing guide in the broader framework in relation to how we need to undertake CBA or cost benefit analysis. So what we did was set this appendix up by following those steps. So these sort of lighter green boxes on the right hand side of the diagram, and then explained through each of those steps what are the things from the broader First Nations investment framework that you need to be thinking about at those different points to really, I guess, translate how this applies in an economics evidence perspective. And I guess the intention here is to make, give people the tools and the guidance to ensure that initiatives that have been developed in partnership with First Nations communities that are evidence-based, that are flexible, recognising local approaches and that embed cultural elements, that we're really well positioned to, I guess, explain and articulate the benefits of those when it's coming forward to government for funding decisions, because sometimes a lot of the qualitative or somewhat intangible elements we've found have been hard to communicate and translate through these economic processes. So it's kind of bringing those two perspectives together to make sure that the business cases are, I guess, well articulated. So that's kind of the structure. We don't duplicate what's already in the CBA guide, but just give you the specific guidance in relation to how this framework applies. And one of the key elements, we'll just move to the next slide, is around application of the economic framework of culture that Eugenia mentioned in the community designed chapter. So what this does is a qualitative framework to help identify what are the outcomes that can stem from initiatives that embed cultural elements in them, and how do we sort of demonstrate that in an economic framework and also explain why that is the case. So what we've done here is put a worked example throughout the appendix about a land management example, and looked at when you're working through those steps and trying to show the benefits and costs of different options involving land management, what are the things you'd think through for an option that's more culturally informed with more First Nations community involvement versus another option that doesn't consider those elements, and how can you sort of pick up the benefits of the cultural elements into your analysis? So really that's drawing on elements of institutional economic theory to explain the pathways through which culture can drive broader outcomes. So just as one example, if you've got Aboriginal people applying First Nations traditional knowledge around land management, obviously that is an important cultural practice that delivers cultural outcomes in its own right, which should be picked up in the cost-benefit analysis. There hasn't been a lot of quantitative analysis on specific cultural outcomes to date, and largely a lot of that reflects cultural sensitivities, but we talk through how even if a qualitative approach is being taken, that still should be embedded in the CBA and reflected accordingly alongside the numerical results. But then in addition to that, thinking through what other pathways through which this application of traditional cultural knowledge can also drive broader benefits. And that can include things like greater use of traditional knowledge and information that can drive better environmental outcomes, It can also involve matching of people to employment opportunities, particularly work opportunities on country that can have individual benefits. And so thinking through, what's the full spectrum of outcomes that cultural elements contribute towards, and then picking those up, because you might have benefits that, for example, through education, if there were school groups involved in the program, through sort of community networks and things like that, that we've got more standardized economic measures to value those benefits, and so there's an opportunity there to look at what's the uplift in those measurement of those outcomes when we're embedding cultural elements. And really another key part is about how we define the base case scenario as well. So yeah, I really encourage you to look through that example, and our team's available to provide further guidance if you have more questions on those economic elements as well.
Thanks, Laura. So in terms of the next steps, we've been working on socializing the framework. As Steve mentioned, this was published in October last year. And we've been socializing the framework in different cross-government forums across agencies. And we're also working in partnership with First Nations communities. We've also presented at the cross-jurisdictional forum with different treasuries and representatives as well. In terms of the framework and the resources, we do have video summaries that are available online. We also have the summary document, which is about 15 pages compared to the 138 that we have in the current lengthy document as well. We are working on capacity building through various resources, and also encourage agencies to reach out if you would like to have more tailored, specific presentations or discussions based on the initiatives and the programs that you're working on as well. So we are having ongoing engagements with the sector committees, including the Evidence Bank Working Group. And we're looking at having a review of the framework sometime in 2026. We're also, as Laura mentioned earlier on, building a bank of case studies that are demonstrating different ways of working in partnership with First Nations people and examples of how to define outcomes, if it's also in CBA. So we welcome any case studies that you might have. Please send those through, and we're more than happy to have discussions with you if you think there's something worth exploring as well. In terms of the next steps as well, we've shared the framework with everyone. You also can subscribe to our mailing list, and we'll have a newsletter that will come soon. But I'll pass on to Lateisha to talk a bit more as well in terms of what we've got planned.
Thanks, Eugenia. I think we'll go to the questions first. So I might just go back to Louisa to see if there's any questions for us.
Yes, we've got a few questions coming through. I'm going to start off with a more policy-based question, though, just to get some thoughts going. This is a great tool and, I guess, guidance framework for us preparing cost-benefit analyses. But I think you've mentioned also it could be applied to broader policy development as well. Are there any examples or suggestions you have for us in doing that?
Steve, do you have an answer for that?
Sorry, was the question how the framework would apply to policy development?
That's right.
Yeah, right. So in the broader New South Wales investment framework, you'll see there's basically three pillars, which where one of them is business case development, one's evaluation, and one's regulatory changes. So it's applicable across the board. But yeah, say I'll pick on former transport colleagues. Say you're in a road safety environment and you're looking at something like developing a new graduated licensing scheme. So this has impacts across everybody. And so then you go and develop something like the driver licensing access program, which helps Aboriginal people to get a driver's license. So when you're developing all the kind of policies and program around that, the funding environment, the contracting, you would go out and work with Aboriginal people to do that, the Aboriginal providers, community, and the steps that are there are applicable. So you'd go out and you'd establish relationships with the community to start with, establish formal partnerships with the providers. You talk to the community about what the outcomes are that they're trying to achieve. You could share data across the providers and communities around like licensing and the like, and ultimately hold yourself accountable and be transparent in what you've achieved.
That sounds great. Thank you. I will endeavour to remember that next time I'm doing some policy development, because I think it's a very useful framework. Up next, we have a question from Gabrielle Petrini.
Thank you. Hello, I'm from the regional delivery part of conservation heritage programs and regulation in DQ. So we're working on the New South Wales Plan for Nature, and it involves building participation by First Nations people across, like, right from decision-making policy down through to delivering projects. And to build that decision-making capability, we want to share the design of how we deliver some programs. And I'm just wondering how you do the cost-benefit analysis on that when you don't know exactly what it is that you'll be delivering, because you want it to be designed with Aboriginal people.
That's exactly why we're providing guidance to engage very, very early. So what we tend to do in government is work up our proposals, consider all the options, often come up with a preferred option, and then go and speak to the community. So this guidance would point you to engaging at the options development stage with community. So actually, like chapter 3, which talks about community-led design. So actually work up those options at the beginning and understand what the community priorities are before you even start trying to put values on things.
Okay, thank you.
We'll probably come back to the question of consultation and the timing, but first of all, I think James Bolster has a question on how to monetize or not benefits for Aboriginal people. Sorry, James, here you are. Great.
Yeah, hey, thank you so much. Love this work. I work in the Aboriginal education team in the Office of the Secretary here in New South Wales Department, and we're struggling a bit with how we evaluate and meet the monetization standard in a cost-benefit analysis. And so a couple of things we've been looking at are firstly a Wellbeing, so the more general question. It's valid, it's stable, but it's been monetized and adopted by other treasuries. Have you done any work on that? And then second, related to that, also been looking at Mayi Kawayu, which is that enormous nationwide health and wellbeing study. It's ongoing, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and just sort of adopting maybe some of their questions and bringing it into the same field of monetizing. Have you done any work maybe on either of those or other things that you could suggest?
Thanks, James. I'm happy to jump in on this one. On the Wellbeing element, we haven't had a project recently that's used those measures, but I'm happy to keep chatting further about it. Obviously, there's sort of pros and cons with different sort of metrics and approaches to use. So I don't know if we've nailed it yet there. But yeah, Mayi Kawayu is a really great other source that we've been recommending for people to look into to try and capture some of these cultural elements and I guess move further towards quantitative data. And the really great part about that is the sort of First Nations governance structures around the use of that data and how the questions are framed. Yeah, it's an area where the research is developing, and in some cases it will require, I guess, some more primary research investments from government agencies. But what we think is really important is that is undertaken with First Nations partners and researchers to make sure that we're getting the questions captured correctly, and yeah, that there's, I guess, common understanding of what we're trying to measure and why. So I think, yeah, well, let's keep talking, because there is a it is a challenge, but we think that there's a process that we need to follow to make sure that we get it right. And really, we'd be really interested to understand more about your project. Yeah, and I guess the other side is that if it, you know, we want this all to be proportional to the scale of the work. So obviously that going through that process requires a lot of investment from both sides in resourcing. So where it's deemed that qualitative evidence is the most appropriate given the scale of a program, that we think that should be sort of, might not come up in the CBA sort of the BCR ratio that gets reported in your CBA, but we're sort of trying to shift maybe, I guess, the traditional perspective of what Treasury looks at. It's not just about what that number is. In any case, those numbers are sort of subject to lots of different assumptions and uncertainty, and they sort of really fit within a range. So it just gives you an indication, and the qualitative evidence should be considered seriously alongside that. So sometimes it's a balance, right, of embedding both the numbers and the qualitative side alongside each other to explain in your policy advice and the Treasury's advice to government what that full picture is and whether there's value for money or not.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. We'll talk offline.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a fair bit lately, of the relationship between CBAs and the budget process, and those qualitative and sometimes anecdotal, but really forms of evidence really provide a lot of weight when convincing decision makers of funding bids. So there's lots of ways in which information can be used throughout that process. We next have a question back on from Caroline Reid. If you'd like to come on and ask your question.
Hi, thanks very much. Sorry, I'll just move my screen down. It's a great presentation. I think this framework is incredible. And again, with that cost benefit analysis, incorporating those qualitative benefits into that, I think that's quite revolutionary. I think that's really great. My question, I work firstly with the New South Wales Childcare Economic and Opportunity Fund. So we provide funding really targeted towards increasing economic participation of families so providing funding for early education and care programs. I guess my question is really around, I have learned that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have been frustrated in the past when policymakers and program initiatives have gone out to communities. They've made their consultations, asked questions. Some of those questions are repeated over and over again. So those communities can become frustrated, a bit fatigued by being asked the same question with apparently not a lot of outcome, because after the consultation, there's no further consultation, there's no further collaboration and partnership. So I think that would be a really good piece for that partnership for shared decision making, to make sure that that partnership is really holistic from start to end, because oftentimes I think teams start with the development phase and then delivery phase is different. So making sure that that's a seamless and continued process. So I just wonder if the framework talks about that and gives advice for that, and also considering where to start to research what questions have already been asked, so we're not further frustrating those communities by traversing the same ground, or at least apologising initially and saying, yes, we acknowledge this, but this time we're going to do it differently.
It's something we're not very good at in government. I think there's pockets of good practice. What we tend to do in the closing the gap space, we check in with our peak bodies first. So we go and talk to Coalition of Aboriginal Peak organisations. Has government already done consultation on this? Has CAPO already done consultation on it? So I think in that space, we'd nationally be SNAIC and New South Wales ABSEC. I think I'd be checking in with them to see whether or not there's already been consultation and established positions. But I guess it kind of comes back to that principle about listening as well. So before doing that kind of community engagement, I'd be talking to authorised representative bodies like the regional alliances and asking, like, do you have a position on this? Has there already been consultation? How can we work together to get the best outcome? And that circling back piece, is so important. So once we do actually have, like, a decision goes up the chain, what actually got decided, what what outcomes have we had if an evaluation's eventually done, do we go back and make sure that that's shared? Jump in, Eugenia.
Well, thanks, Steve. I think one other way, just as a practical example, what we did when we were developing the framework, after every consultation series, the evaluator or the consultants that we were working with would write up summaries that we would share with every person that attended the session. And we would sense check whether we had accurately captured everything that had been put on paper. And then at the end of the process, when the report was being drafted, we would send out emails just to notify people. So sometimes it's also those in-between steps as you're developing any project or program or policy, just keeping them informed along the way, and also sense checking ideas and thoughts as well.
I might also just add to that, Caroline, team. So I think also within Priority Reform 4 around data sharing, we're very cognizant that this happens a lot. The consultation fatigue, the numerous consultations where communities are over-consulted and kind of providing feedback and advice on things multiple times. I think, as Steve said, we don't do it well in government, and we need to definitely coordinate a lot better. Aboriginal Affairs has awareness of this. They are trying to kind of lead that coordination piece, particularly around going out to community and making sure there's a bit of a forward schedule and we can sort of coordinate as government departments to potentially not be causing more fatigue where possible. But I think also from a PR4 perspective, also not only sharing data with community, but sharing data within government agencies in itself can be a challenge, right? So there's a lot of great intelligence and information from communities that can be shared internally, and doing that more and better. At present, it's probably we're relying on those individual relationships and that goodwill between teams and people, but we need to really, I guess, bring a bit more of a structure as to how that can be done really well and easily. Huge challenge.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we can squeeze in one more question, but we will finish exactly on 11 o'clock. So Asha Richardson, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Yes, good morning. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to speak. I just thought I'd drop it in there. So I've written a little bit of detail. We are working on the notion that what works best for Aboriginal people may actually work best for all people. And it just seems that there is so much in the work that you are presenting today that could actually cross over to multiple cultures. Of course, there are individual considerations, but there's so much that could cross over, and actually it is just in many ways the best way to work with human beings. And so that's what we're actually exploring in our work. And I just wonder whether or not that's something that you've given consideration to, cross-cultural application, or actually this is just what we want to adapt as BAU because it's just the way it's best to work with humans. Not to take away, individual cultural considerations, but just that so much of this works, or we would expect would just work for everybody.
Yeah, definitely. I think the practical steps, principles and guiding questions will work with all cultures. There's a lot there around universal design principles and ensuring it works for everybody. Recognising, of course, that we've got very diverse Aboriginal communities and very diverse, culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So always got to tailor our approach and listen to those communities that we go out and engage with.
Thank you. What a great question to end on. I just wanted to see if Edwina had the team had any last thoughts they wanted to finish up with before we close off.
We do, and I might just quickly throw to Lateisha with the last slide.
Yeah, sure. Eugenia, if you could just go to the supporting application slide. I'll keep it really quick. So we know that it can be tricky to put frameworks like this into practice. That's why our team is here to help. I would encourage you to use the framework and all the linked resources available. I think Eugenia has put the link for that in the chat. Also, you can share the summary video and explainer tools with your teams. You can sign up to our mailing list for updates and new resources. If you've got a great case study or example or something that you've tried, even if it didn't go perfectly, we would love to hear from you. You can also email us at fanu@treasury.nsw.gov.au. And before you go, or in your own time, I would love for you to take a minute to fill out our feedback form. It just helps us improve our sessions moving forward. And thank you so much for your time and energy today. We really appreciate you being part of this important conversation. I will just pop the link for the survey into the chat. If you don't have time to do it right now, that's fine. But in your own time, it would be lovely to get that feedback. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for the fabulous presentation. Thank you to our audience for your interest and enthusiasm in policy. Until next time, take care. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.